To the Public Bathing Forum. My name is Samin Mahboubi. I'm one of the 4 co-founders of Hearth. It's a DIY art space here in Toronto. And this is our first time hosting an online event, so pray for the best. Okay, so first off, Hearth, my home, and the home of many people attending this event from where is now known as on maps as Toronto, are currently situated on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and previously the Huron-Wendat. I would like to honor the land acknowledgement as something that is alive and ever shifting, unable to be completed, an endless process of change as we commit to always be reflecting, responding, and learning about what it means to live and work on stolen land. In my role as a settler living and working in Toronto, peace treaties that predate the colonial project, such as the One Dish, One Spoon Wampum Belt, motivate me to support and cultivate community through all of my endeavors on this land. Just as the treaty encourages the sharing of resources using a single spoon, in my role as co-founder of Hearth, I seek to redistribute opportunities, resources, and share knowledge, prioritizing artists and culture workers on the margins. Thanks. So, okay, thanks for coming tonight, everyone. So tonight's program is going to be structured around 4 individual presentations, which will then be followed by a group discussion. So Greta Hamilton, who is here, is going to be reading first, and then we will watch Richard Fung's short film called Steamed Clean, followed by Jess, Misak, who will share with us excerpts from their thesis, where they reimagined Dufferin Mall as a public bathhouse. And lastly, a reading and writing prompt by Fan Wu. Tonight's programming is being recorded and will be posted on Hearth's website and YouTube channel later. So if anyone doesn't want to be on camera or anything, you can turn that off, please. If you have any questions or comments for the discussion at the end that you want to make anonymously, you can privately message me or Greta and we can read them. And just a warning that this evening's program will contain explicit depictions and discussions around sex and sexuality, as well as some videoed sex. We offer this forum as an opportunity to think collectively about pleasure and social intimacies in the context of public bathing. In advance of the discussion period at the end of the event, here are some questions that have guided our program tonight. How do bathhouses shape our relation to each other, to strangers, or to our communities? How do public bathing sites cultivate intimacy in the architecture of our city? Does it feel urgent in the midst of a pandemic to create space for collective pleasure, rest, and reflection? How does the conviviality of public bathing shape our relationship to other kinds of social and communal sites? So think about those, and we'll come back at the end of the event to talk about them. So lastly, the program tonight was organized by Greta Hamilton, and Greta is an extremely talented writer and arts worker currently based in British Columbia. The program was born out of their thesis, and I'd like to thank them for approaching Hearth for the opportunity to partner on this event. I'm personally extremely excited. I know that it's going to be amazing. And I'd also like to thank Jess, Fan, and Richard for sharing their excellent work with all of us this evening. So please keep your microphones muted, and we'll talk together at the end of the meeting. And Greta.
Thank you, Samin, for the introduction. Very kind. And thank you to everyone for being here. I'm currently residing as a settler. I'm trying to let people into the meeting at the same time as I'm talking. I'm currently residing as a settler on Lake Watak, Wakwakiwak territory, where I grew up and have been living for the last 6 months. I'd like to acknowledge the immense privilege it is to live and work here and extend my gratitude to my family and my community for nourishing me here. I'd also like to thank Samin and the folks at Hearth for supporting this event, the Center for Emerging Artists and Designers at OCAD, and especially I would like to thank Jess and Richard and Fan for agreeing to conspire together on the topic and share their work today. As Samin mentioned, I wrote my undergraduate thesis in visual culture at OCAD this past spring on the topic of public bathing. So the text that I'll be reading from today draws on my thesis and also includes some new writing and bits of correspondences with friends and some other people's poems. So I will hop into that. Okay. Depending who's asking. After C.A. Conrad's Unknown Duration of Fear. No matter how densely our planet is populated, we only permit touching strangers in a few locations. Crowded subways, airports, the graze of a hand while exchanging money. We don't often touch strangers unless it's an accident and then you apologize. You're not likely to hold the stranger's hand. But if you know them a little, you can shake their hand hello. If you are close friends, you get a hug. If you are lovers, you can taste and smell each other. And this is a thing the world awaits. There are, of course, exceptions to the rules of public intimacy. The bathhouse, public bathing sites, queer bars, beaches, and parks are all sites with fleshy underbellies teeming with human touch. While bathhouses are often coded as either bathing sites or cruising sites, in visiting pools, sex clubs, and saunas, I've witnessed a collapse of these boundaries. There is always sensuality, conviviality, and pleasure when we bathe together. Whether or not there's sexual touch, there is always intimacy. I think of this intimacy as queer, public pleasure and leisure that alters our relationality. While we often avoid touch in public, stepping aside on the sidewalk as a body brushes by, or keeping our hands apart on subway poles, in bathing, we allow our bodies to settle in next to each other, a collision of flesh and fluids. In the sauna at the Y, conversations flow as rocks heat the crackling wood. Women offer their recipes for tom yum soup, for making shea butter lotions, and there are lyrical interludes in languages I don't speak. On late nights, the ambient noise of rushing water from the whirlpool outside is punctuated by moans. A woman in the whirlpool lifts her leg up onto a jet. I think this a song of longing, her voice breaking into that personal pleasure we keep so quiet. God's List of Liquids by Anne Carson. It was a November night of wind. Leaves tore past the window. God had the book of life open at pleasure and was holding the pages down with one hand. For I made their flesh as a sieve, wrote God, at the top of the page, and then listed in order: alcohol, blood, gratitude, memory, semen, song, tears, time. I tried on my first strap-on in the bathroom of a sex shop last August. I undressed to my underwear and looked in the mirror. My oversized men's t-shirt clung to my back with sweat. I pulled the leather harness over each of my thighs, trying to hold the dildo in place. The silicone was like a plum against my flesh, a few shades too dark for me. I turned side to side in the mirror, inspecting the size and shape, how it changed my silhouette. I felt strong, even though the colors weren't right. I have a friend with many names. They punctuate it differently depending who's asking. Sometimes it's spelled with a hyphen. Sometimes there are no letters in it at all. The first time we fucked, we made up new words for each other. I traced their fluids with my tongue like an automatic drawing, a translation of bodily space. Excerpt from T. Fleischman's Time is the Thing a Body Moves Through. I love this speech because I know that I can go alone and that there I will find several friends. It's very important, I think, to keep going to a gay beach because that way people who are strangers to you will be able to meet their friends there. In an email correspondence, my friend Assad reflected on some ideas we had been sharing about bathing. He wrote, "It is as though shared corporeality exists as an opposite to the forced delineating tendencies of bathing, of heteronormativity, rather. Our togetherness in bathing is a reflection of a naturally diffuse and queer state of being. In the absence of pools and saunas, I found other places to swim. I stood at the edge of the ocean in my underwear and watched Erin tread into the horizon. The tide peeled in and touched my toes. Pebbles and broken shells burrowed into my feet. I followed her into the water, watching as she swayed her arms for balance against waves and uneven rocks. I thought about other times I had followed behind her, looking on with envy at her bravery. She turned to look at me and counted 1, 2, 3. I held my breath and submerged. Water propels us into liminality, that liquid state that allows us to transform. When we emerge, our bodies become solid again, with the knowledge that they have once been fluid. The heat drained from my head. I turned to Erin, our underwear now wet and see-through. I wanted at once to rest my head in that delicate triangle of her lap, and at the same time to stay there, fixed in the wicked cold, watching her swim. After Frank O'Hara. Having a sweat with you is more fun than letting my fingers shrivel in a ditch. Having a sweat with you is more fun than undressing on the dance floor, than watching the slow back and forth of flaccid flesh in a hand job, than peeling myself from a milk-colored tub. Having a sweat with you is more fun than that dildo on that mechanical bull. Thank you. Okay. I'm going to turn things over now to Richard. We're going to screen Steam Clean. So I finished off with that image, which was a still from Richard's Steam Clean. The film was made in the 1990s with the AIDS Committee of Toronto, and I always read it as a super tongue-in-cheek safe sex advertisement because there's quite a bit more pleasure happening in it than in many advertisements from that era.
Thanks so much, Greta and Stamin. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background around Steam Clean. Steam Clean was made in 1990 in the context of two interconnected battles around representation: the HIV/AIDS epidemic and the porn wars. Gay liberation was inspired by the civil rights movement, the national liberation movements, particularly in Vietnam and Southern Africa, and women's liberation. It was part of a larger drive towards sexual liberation. But after the first case of HIV was reported in 1981 and a link to sexual transmission was made, a cultural shift took place in gay culture, gay communities, and gay politics. Promiscuity was increasingly regarded as a cause of AIDS, and a new respectability accompanied a realignment of gay liberation to gay rights. In the US, marriage and the military became the benchmarks for measuring gay acceptance, a term that Jess has famously called homonationalism. In the late 1980s, Toronto was home to several saunas directly serving the needs of MSM, that's men who have sex with men, and an acronym I'm using, but a useful one, a category that arose with AIDS prevention. A couple of baths, like the Oak Leaf near to Bathurst and Queen, turned a blind eye to sex among patrons, most of whom were there really for the sauna and the steam, but other things went on kind of semi-officially. Steam Clean was filmed at the Spawn Maitland, the space currently occupied by the US chain Steamworks in the gay village. At that time, we were still calling it the gay ghetto. Thanks to personal connections, my partner knew one of the owners. We got permission to shoot before it was opened to customers. I chose to set this video at the baths to counter the growing conservatism. My driving mission was to communicate that AIDS prevention was about safer sex practices, not abstinence. Steam Clean was commissioned by New York's Gay Men's Health Crisis, GMHC, as part of its series of safer sex shorts, explicit videos whose purpose was to demonstrate safer sex practices and make them appear sexy. They were to be played in bars and clubs where gay men and MSM congregate. 4 of the 6 tapes feature gay men. One showcases performance artist and activist Annie Sprinkle with the lesbian tape. Another trans model Tracy Africa, and the voguing community. All have Black or mixed Black-white casts. I think I was invited to produce the tape because GMHC couldn't find an appropriate director in the US for the video aimed at Asian Americans. And I can't remember how the ACT involvement came about, but it was also co-sponsored by AIDS Committee of Toronto. This collaboration between GMHC and ACT led to complications because of national differences in safe sex policies. Whereas bathhouses in many US cities were shut down in the name of AIDS prevention, health authorities in Toronto kept them open as sites of AIDS education. In the US, condoms were advised for anal and oral sex, and one of the US shorts shows a man putting a condom on his partner's erect cock, dripping honey on it and licking it off. In Canada, by contrast, the lack of evidence for oral sex as a significant means of HIV transmission meant that condoms were not recommended as necessary for blowjobs, and the producers at ACT prescribed the depiction of oral sex with a condom so as not to confuse the message. This is why the only genital act depicted in Steam Clean is fucking. In fact, as opposed to the inevitability of anal sex in porn narratives, it's the way that they end, before the money shot. My own experience in bathhouse hookups is that anal sex is actually not assumed. The demographics in gay saunas vary by establishment and by, say, specialty night. But in general, they more closely reflect the people at a random downtown intersection in Toronto than the pretty couples that you'd see in an ad by, say, TD. Gay baths are popular with immigrants, with East and Southeast Asian men, and also with seniors, and this demographic has elicited backlash on social media. Some establishments attempt to curate their clientele through advertising and age-specific and student discounts. One participant in my 1984 documentary, Orientations, Lesbian and Gay Asian, describes a scene of carding in a US bathhouse against a Black would-be client. These measures, the more subtle ones that are used today anyway, that still persist, are only partially successful, and it's not uncommon that the clientele in the publicity and the clientele in the bathhouse look completely different. I did my part to subvert systemic discrimination. I returned for a second undergraduate and graduate degree long after my first, and so I got discounts with my student card well into my late 30s. Steam Clean evokes the cruising etiquette and the demographic range of the bathhouse, as much as could be matched by my roommates and friends, members of community groups like Gay Asians Toronto, Kush, and Zami, and artists like John Grayson and Colin Campbell, whom some of you might recognize. The other battle I referred to earlier was the porn wars. Religious conservatives were always against sexual representation on moral grounds. But this battle saw a face-off between two sides that saw themselves as progressives. On the one hand were feminists who claimed a causal relationship between pornography and violence against women. And on the other, artists, sexual minorities, including gay men and lesbians, and anti-censorship feminists. As a racialized gay man, I noticed that the arguments put forward by both sides assumed that performers and consumers of commercial sexual representation were white. Gay Asian men with whom I had been organizing since 1980 had a much more complicated and conflicted relationship to gay pornography, which remains overwhelmingly white except for a few highly stereotyped portrayal of racial others. Much of my work on pornography from the mid-1980s attempted to analyze and critique commercial gay porn while simultaneously insisting on the right to sexual representation. I'd been involved in the 6 Days of Resistance against the Ontario Censor Board in 1985. Just as AIDS prevention became the alibi for LGBT organizing in many places where homophobia is illegal, places like in India and Trinidad, both of whom have since decriminalized homosexual activity, AIDS prevention was a justification for the safer sex shorts being sexually explicit. In closing, I want to connect the current pandemic to the earlier epidemic, because it's kind of interesting to think about both of them in relation to questions of transmission and in questions of gay bathhouses. Before Toronto shut down non-essential businesses a couple of weeks ago, workers at gay saunas had been organizing against bathhouses reopening without proper safety precautions in place, afraid that they would be called back to work and placed in danger. So that's interesting to then think about not just the clients, but also the infrastructure and the people who work there. The COVID-19 and sex page of the BC Centre for Disease Control website, among other pieces of advice, such as sticking with one or a few partners, promotes glory holes as a way of controlling virus spread, which I thought was really interesting. But other than perhaps some owners, no one is clamoring for gay saunas to reopen just yet. So we'll have to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. That was fantastic. My name's Jess. I want to thank Greta and Samin for having me. I'm more than pleased to be here. I'm an architect and artist working in Toronto, and I'm going to switch things up a little bit and speak about a version of my thesis project, which I completed last year for the Masters of Architecture project program at U of T Daniels. So I will share my screen. And as was mentioned before, this project is a speculative bathhouse, and it's based in Dufferin Mall, but a lot of the research and the discussions surrounding it are more to do with queer spaces to relax within the city of Toronto. And it's called Bed Bath & Beyond. So welcome to the bath. This is a queer bathhouse. It's a space for queer bodies to relax the body expression and also the sexual expression. The towels are pink. And the texts are precious. Oops, sorry. And these are just a few of the kind of guiding key texts that I read that relate to the body, mostly to do with kind of material body expression and environment as non-binary. So one of the key taglines for the bathhouse is not everyone who goes to the bath goes for sex, but all benefit from the idea that some do. And I'll jump back into that later, but first I want to kind of share a story, a Roman bath story, and this is the story of Apollonius of Tyre in the Roman bath complex of Sardis, which you can see a ruin on the left. So Apollonius of Tyre is a young man in Rome, and he enters the bathhouse in this space called the Palestra Field. And I'm going to walk through a couple of the kind of architectural typologies that pop up in the Roman bathhouse structure. So this Palestra Field is open, it's open air, it's a social space, a space for recreation, and it's a space where you might meet someone. And Apollonius does. He meets a young man and they decide to continue through the bathhouse together. They enter this space that I've been calling the tepid flirting zone. This is a space that doesn't have any hot steam or necessarily any hot water, but it is the beginning of the sexualizing of the space of the bathhouse. This is where they get naked for the first time and they flirt. They find something within each other and they decide to continue throughout the bathhouse to the space that I call the steamy hot zone. And this zone of the bathhouse is much higher, but it's also much tighter. It has steam coming up from the floors through holes and vats that were being heated underneath and in the walls, which were double walled. It's thick, there are enclaves within the poche, and the water is hot, sometimes in pots and sometimes in actual pools. And so if we kind of broke this down as a diagram architecturally, you can see that the beginning starts kind of architecturally visual. We transitioned into a space of longing, a space of visual gaze and flirtation. We moved to a more tactile space, and then the space transitions into a more central, non-visual touch space. And in this diagram, it's kind of depicted at a more of a linear focus, but all of these themes are constantly being folded in on each other and reimagined throughout the spaces and throughout the different interactions and paths that people and partners and groups might take throughout the space. And then moving from this Roman example, I began applying this to spaces in contemporary bathhouses in Toronto and in the US. This is a floor plan of Steamworks and an image of it. And you can see a similar progression. So the entrance and lounge might be considered the palestra field, the locker rooms, the tepid flirting zone, and then you enter into the kind of labyrinth of play in darker and tighter spaces, sometimes lit, sometimes visually not as present as transitioning over to tactile space. And concurrently, I was also looking at a history of kind of sex in the city of Toronto. And if we look back to the 70s and the Body Politic magazine, you get things like, you know, a map of subtextual spaces in Toronto, you know, cruising spots that if you knew kind of the handshake, you would know where to go. And then there's also the transition of what these spaces have become. Some of them have kind of stayed. Queen's Park, for example, still holds somewhat of a prominent space for queers in Toronto. Some of the beaches, but other places have given away to condos, to sports bars, and you know, sometimes in the case of art institutions. And kind of at the focal point of often of the subtextual spaces in Toronto, you had the queer bathhouses, and in these bathhouses were masked. They were masked socially. So you may, you know, take a drag on once you enter, but you might don a more heteronormative drag outside of the bathhouse. But they were also masked architecturally, and that's to say that there were no signifiers on the facade or front of the building that would lead or give away to the queerness and excitement that was happening within the bathhouse itself. And you know, they were masked for a reason, and this relates to, you know, the coordinated attacks of the bathhouse raids by the police in the 1980s, which closed many of them forever, which, you know, led to some, well, was part of a, you know, some of the resistance in Toronto, which has given us some rights, you could say, but a lot of the rights and movements that LGBTQ people have made in Toronto and in Canada have a lot aligned more with homonormativity, you know, prioritizing a certain socioeconomic white gay male or white lesbian. And we can see this play out in the architecture and the urban spaces of Toronto. Recently in my neighborhood, 4 beloved queer bars shut down one after the other. And I'll come back to the site later because this greatly informs Dufferin Mall here as the site of the intervention, I would say, architectural intervention. But I also want to kind of touch on a couple of the interviews and things that I was also doing at the same time in the community, talking to people who identified as trans or non-binary, speaking about the body and where you feel comfortable, where you're able to relax in Toronto. And this led to a couple key themes that came out, one being that bedroom life happens outside just as much as in, and that queer bodies need to relax. Which then leads to the kind of thesis of the project, which is repositioning queer space or queer subtextual space into Toronto's normalized civic world. So here we have Dufferin Mall, a site I'm sure we're all familiar with, and I'm particularly interested in the mall as a space of loitering, as a space that encourages different levels of social interaction, perhaps casual, perhaps more intimate, but also as a space that's heavily normalized, which I think leads into a lot of play for subtext. The bathhouse is meant to be for those seeking sexual experiences, those seeking queer space, those seeking body relaxation, and those seeking loitering. And so then we come back to this play of the field, the tepid, and the hot, steamy zone. So this plays out in the mall itself. So here, the back of the mall becomes the front of the bathhouse. This is the back door of the field. Then we move to the tepid in the mall. This is where you begin to get the flirtation of queerness within this kind of normalized space, heteronormative space. You have the facade of the bathhouse, which is still blank and subtextual, but slightly subversive. You know something is there, and there's an insertion of a fountain signifying a wet space. And then from this, you get the bath, the steamy hot, and you can see it in the plan here. This is about the footprint of the bathhouse. And then again, within the bathhouse itself and its floor plan and its design, the field, tepid, and hot play comes up again. So here are three icons signifying, excuse me, the main water features of the space. So you get the shower here, the tepid pool, and the steamy kind of hot play zone in the back, including a kind of sexy splash pad. And then this plays out also with the space surrounding these focal points. So you have a field zone here, tepid and steamy. And then this transitions into the plan. So just for those who are familiar with reading architectural drawings, the black thick line is where the building has been cut, the roof taken off. And coming down from this is the plan and also an elevation. So it's called a planimetric. You see some of the walls and also the floor. And so here you get kind of the entrance, you've got your field, the back door entrance, the beginning of flirtation within the mall, the sequence to enter, you descend into a field of thin columns. They've got curtains, they've got locker rooms, there's a shower, and then you descend again to the tepid zone, a lukewarm pool, you have your first saunas, you have a tea room, you have small nooks and crannies for flirting, open spaces for flirting and socializing and relaxing. And as you ascend, there's these thicker, more poche wall spaces. These open up and sometimes close to more intimate spaces, spaces for sex, spaces for glory holes, spaces where you might have just a tub that fits two, or you might have a longer promenade-like strip of hot tub. And then exiting this, there are private rooms for booking, a space to reset and refresh, being a kind of disco cafe. And then outside again, continues this idea of play just with a kind of open experience. And then you can loop back around. I hope everyone can see my mouse, what I'm doing. So this, oops. And then these are, playing through the spaces again, this being the locker room space. You see curtains coming down, sometimes obscuring pieces of flesh, sometimes obscuring moments of intimacy, sometimes opening it up. And then the shower in the background. You move on to the tepid, flirty zone. You have your tea space, your saunas, the columns begin to thicken up. You have these body suggestive pool furniture. And then as you come up, you enter the steamy hot zone, spaces where you may be able to see. Sometimes you may only be able to have a whisper of suggestion of what's going on. Sometimes you might not be able to see it at all. And then here we can walk through a section. So you've got the mall over here, you get a view into a sauna, the pool space, the steamy hot disco cafe. We've got the garden of pleasure over here and the sexy splash pad. And then unfortunately I wasn't able to keep this giant model, but I did do a series of models for the project. This was cast in plaster, and it has terracotta people relaxing or fucking. And I also did a series of ceramics, which maybe perhaps later I can show in person. And these I sculpted and fired myself, which was a learning experience. This is the tepid pool. And you've got the shower here, with the other side being the fountain and a view of the facade. And I also have a view of the courtyard in the back. And just that's Bed Bath & Beyond.
Thank you so much, Jess. And thank you so much to Greta and to Hearth and to Jess and Richard. My work is definitely building off of the work in sort of gay bathhouse history and architecture. I did spill half a bottle of fuck water yesterday. I don't know if you've ever spilled silicone-based lube before, but it's horrible. I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. It's like a puddle of dildo has appeared on my floor. If anyone has any tips on how to clean off the silicone-based lube, just please type in the comments. You can DM me privately. But I take it as some sort of sign from God that something's gonna happen tonight. So I'm gonna read a short piece about the sensuality of gay bathhouses. That's almost a sort of first-person version of Jess's presentation. To use a video game metaphor, where Jess was doing SimCity, I'm doing like the Call of Duty version, but like in the same world. And I'm going to use my own writing to lead into a sort of writing meditation, where I'll invite all of you to unfold your fantasies of the bathhouse. So please do take this time to grab a large piece of paper, or open a Word doc on your computer, however you prefer to work. So I'll give everyone a second to choose their medium. And if you are sensitive to film spoilers, please do tune out for the first minute and a half. But I promise you that the film I want to talk about is too good to be spoiled. So don't worry about that. So I'm just going to show a few stills. In Taiming Liang's film, The River, the main character, a young man perpetually bent over with a bad crick in his neck, enters a bathhouse seeking relief from the boredom of his chronic pain. He sits down in a dark room beside a prone body, who begins to rub him down. The main character twists his grimacing body at the precipice between pain and pleasure. When the lights come on, post-hand job, he realizes that the man who fucked him in the shadows was none other than his own father, who then slaps him across the face. Because no words are left between father and son in this doomed coupling. What's shocking about this encounter in watching this film is not the fact of incest itself, but the intimacy that father and son are only able to give each other under the guise of being absolute strangers. For after all, a bathhouse ought to be the kind of place where people can exchange themselves as currency in a no-strings-attached sexual economy, liberated from the trap of one's daily identity, the drudgery of being known and being seen. The horror in The River is witnessing carefree casual sex collapse into the family tree, into this kind of precise filial infidelity. Because what burns identity into us more violently than the inescapability of bloodlines? Greta reminded me of this story that Bersani tells in his book, Is the Rectum a Grave?, where a headline reads, "Father says he would shoot son if he were gay." And then in the interview, the son says, "I think my dad would shoot me whether or not I was gay." There's a kind of violent, tender, inhospitable queerness that seems built into the very nature of the father-son relationship that Tsai Liang then makes explode in his film. The river presents to us the bleakest underbelly, where the bathhouse opens onto its opposite, incest. But even in general experience, the bathhouse is a space of pain and pleasure commingling. I refer to my experiences in male-exclusive gay bathhouses when I say the bathhouse, limiting the scope of this term to my lived experience. But there's something savory, something seductive in the possibility of reckless sex out in the open, tickled persistently by risk. When it comes to fucking, I'm what they would call a late bloomer, so the bathhouse exerts an intense psychic force on my sex-shy body, where awkwardness is ingrained into its history of touch. The bathhouses I've visited, in Taiwan, in Amsterdam, and in Toronto, range from humbler proletariat quarters, central spa, communal spaces stacked with back issues of Home and Garden, all the way to the chlorinated labyrinths with all their features cribbed parodically from pornography. Features like glory hole, sex maze, steel sling. As someone who's constantly fascinated by the fact that sex exists, my time in those bathhouses was partly lascivious, partly sociological. So allow me to excavate a few of my observations from a time before time, when we were allowed to touch like this. In the bathhouse, consent's thresholds are lowered. To pay admission to the bathhouse is to assent to be touched first. To say no, you have to pull away in action. A man jumps out from behind a leather curtain and peels my ass open like an unripe peach. I feel a ripping pain at both ends. He says a string of indistinct words to me in a wolf's voice. My sense of self-preservation wins out over my lustful abandon and I pry him off my body. In a parallel universe, perhaps I succumb and engage in rough, thoughtless, methy sex with this dark interloper. In the bathhouse, the death drive flickers in risky moments of ambiguity, where pain and pleasure meld against each other, where what you want and what you know you shouldn't want swirl together. And the disintegration of verbal consent creates a space where feeling comes before desire. This inversion of feeling and desire produces a limited kind of freedom, namely freedom from types, freedom from your own narratives of, I want this kind of body and not this other kind, freedom from preferences encrusted into reality by habit, pigeonhole preferences like I fuck twinks, not jocks. Desire's orientation tends to chain the future to the past. What I want can only be what I've wanted before. Thought of this way, desire becomes destiny. But what if we led instead by feeling instead of by desire? And to lead by feeling means to be attuned to the intensity of the present moment and all its unforeseen pleasures. In an Amsterdam bathhouse, a sinewy boy who was the spitting image of Puck from A Midsummer Night's Dream slipped into the jacuzzi. In a movement that was half coax, half goad, he began to pull our bodies together with a smile that read, "What the hell have you got to lose?" He began to bring us together into the center of the circle of the jacuzzi, and us shy fags, we blushed in the pool, our limbs leaden with hesitation, but he had no shame. He kissed each of us in turn, wrapped his legs around us, and tried his very best to stir together a gentle orgy. We couldn't acquiesce in the end. We evinced nothing more than a kind of terrified bemusement. We were too tightly wound, tightly wound, too neurotic, too sullen to play with Puck. At the same time, the judgments of desire are more intensified in the bathhouse than anywhere else. It's the barest example of the meat market of normative sexual economies. and you get to see how bodies are valued and weighed by the gazes of a gallery of strangers. Here, beauty burns with a very immediate currency. One man's body is sculptural as he cuts through the shadow, his chalk-tight bone structure effervescent. I pursue him in slowly turned corners, too awed to touch him. Or another man's body is adorned with 12 pairs of groping limbs. He looks like a human Medusa, composed of those who slaver at his feet. Here is a buffet of bodies that sometimes bites back with what they signify in reality. Or there are those rooms that men would rent, who splay their holes wide open, their heads buried in chlorinated sheets, receptive to whatever fuck from any willing passerby. I was always too sentimental for these rooms, in which beauty was no concern. Central humanist that I am, I demand a face and its manifold gestures when I have sex. Or perhaps I'm just a garden variety prude romantic at the end of the day, whose primal need is to have his heart and not his hole filled. I've always felt a kind of fascinatingly repressive air in these gay male bathhouses, an atmosphere of anxiety that narrows the possibility of contact down to sex. Which doesn't mean that other forms of sensuality are impossible, but here, it's tenderness that takes place in the shadows. Sex has become a shield against intimacy. I think often about my older friends' stories of AIDS-era bathhouses, where they were crucial gathering spots for homosociality, where the community could get together, share news, and relay between friendship and frottage. Richard Fung's Steam Clean, which we've all watched, offers a more whimsical, effective atmosphere to the bathhouse than the seedier version that I've lived and been involved with. Looking back to the past of the bathhouse, then, is simultaneously a looking out toward its future. What will become of the bathhouse space after the pandemic? Will the unpartnered masses rush out in droves for their chance at the slip and slide of sexual possibility? Or will we have an initial period of sheepishness, our social skills, not to mention our sexual expertises, perhaps rusted over? And why shouldn't the post-pandemic bathhouse incorporate a greater range of motions for our naked bodies? Playing, joking, exploring, tickling, relaxing, sublimating, sighing. Jess Misak's speculative bathhouse is the kind of space I wonder if Toronto will want and will come to want after the pressure of the pandemic has lifted. An expansive bathhouse where different fantasies of the erotic, in the full regalia of their open trust nudity, can come to bathe. But instead of ending on my fantasies of the bathhouse, I want to give everyone space at the conclusion of these 4 presentations to think and write through what bathing brings out for you. So I'll guide you all through a writing meditation on the psychic space of the bathhouse. And this can be any variety of bathhouse, sexy, non-sexy, Russian spa, Korean spa, or a kind of totally fantasized space. So wherever your memories and desires take you. So let's bring out our notebooks or our Word documents, whichever you prefer. And so it's going to be about 6 minutes, and we're going to write today in a non-stop way. So the aim of this is to try to not think too much, but just let your hand be the recording device of your thought. So we're going to write with our eyes closed, and we're going to try to respond to the vaporousness of the bathhouse itself. So your writing may become drawing at any given point. If it wants to sublimate into shapes and lines, that's a kind of exciting transformation. Throughout the writing process in these 6 minutes, I'll give you all instructions that you can flow with if they evoke something in you. So I was thinking we can start, unless your house is really loud, let's start with our mics unmuted. This will give us a sense of ambient space and ambient sound and the accidents that come in from other people's spaces, I think is really fitting to the sort of bathhouse space. So, if you're comfortable with it. And your video is, of course, totally optional. Okay. Let's begin with the eyes closed. And with your eyes closed, feel free to put your hand to the paper and your pen to the paper. The steam around you is primordial. It turns the room into a blank slate for possibility. Please begin to write or draw. What does the floor look like where you are? And what do the walls look like? What temperature is the water? How does your body feel here? What temperature is your body? What's the scent of the soap? What are you looking for? Is there anyone else there? If so, who else is bathing with you? What are those other bathers doing? Is there anything you want? How does your body feel now? Can you release how your body feels into your hands that are writing? Can your writing take the shape of your bathhouse feelings, of your feelings of bathing, the shape of dripping or squeezing? The fog of the sauna is slowly clearing, and you can come back to us by slowly and gently, whenever you're ready, opening your eyes. Thank you all so much. So I think what we're going to do, Greta, is we're going to open it up to discussion. So this is a time for you to share your experiences of the bathhouse, of bathing, or you can share parts of the writing that you've just done. So it's totally open ground for free discussion.
Yeah, if there's questions for Jess or Fan or Richard or myself, or if folks want to go ahead and share their writing, anything is welcome. We'll try to stay on Zoom only for another like 30 minutes or so.
I have a prompt maybe for discussion. Richard, you brought up something really interesting about the role of the people working in the bathhouses, and like the extent to which we kind of include them as like part of the role that bathhouses play, I guess. And I was wondering, like, what maybe just as like an open prompt for discussion, but the element of service that's not necessarily done as a form of waged labor, but as an integral element of the provision of these kinds of queer bathing services. Like, if there were any sort of speculations or visions or anything that you wanted to talk about in terms of like the role of the host of the bathhouse.
Since you mentioned me, I maybe I'll start things off, and other people might have other things to say. I mean, one of the things is that the early bathhouses, just like the early gay bars, were often not owned by gay people, but owned often in many places by the mafia or by by other people who are in it for profit. At the same time, many people who worked in those places, many of the people who cleaned or looked after the desk, were gay men who, particularly when we're looking back. So, for instance, today I was just hearing something, and I can't remember. It was a group called the Glamour Boys. It's a podcast, and it talks about bathhouses in the 1930s. And I know that the Continental Baths, which is probably the most famous bathhouse ever, which was the one that made the careers of Bette Midler and Barry Manilow, but also hosted people like everyone from the Andrews Sisters to Natalie Cole, etc. I mean, these were places where, in the era when there was much more homophobia, and homophobia was permitted in workplaces in hiring and firing, that gay men could get jobs, right? And often there were places where, for example, my roommates had jobs, people who were students or people who were like artists, so it was a place of exploitation. The wages weren't high, but they were a place where they could kind of be themselves and be within a milieu. They were often clients, so that you would find people, for example, who worked at a masseur in a bathhouse. After their shift was over, they would don a towel and walk with everyone else. So there was that kind of relationship, I suppose. And there was I suppose in some ways, in terms of server-servee, a much more of a perhaps egalitarian relationship that you might find, say, in a fancy restaurant, right? And the difference between the wait staff and the clientele. And so there was much more kind of reciprocity between the people rotating through these different roles. But the owners definitely and generally were in a different category. And that's where you see this tension now that was happening. And I know this because my partner, who actually happens to be writing a novel now that's set in a bathhouse, that he's was approached by bath workers to, because of his history in terms of gay organizing, who were scared that they might be forced back into unsafe conditions because people were getting excited to possibly open up establishments again, and they were worried that they were going to be forced back to work. So I'll let other people take over. Thanks for that question, though.
Hey, Richard, there's a question for you in the chat. I can read it for you, Richard. Did the Misak report affect the distribution of your films in the US? It's from Eggy. Thank you, Eggy. Oh. Richard, you're muted, sorry. You got it.
Did the Misak report affect the distribution of your films in the US? Could you remind me what the Misak report is, Aggie? I mean, it rings a bell, but it's slipping my mind right now.
So it was a report done in 1986 that was released. I think it was an FBI or CIA operation. I think it was FBI actually. It was about pornography, and it kind of led to a lot of legislation surrounding pornography and the distribution of porn.
Thanks. I mean, to be honest, I don't quite completely. I haven't followed the distribution of that video by GMHC. But as I was saying, that I think that one of the things that they were trying to do is to justify the sexual representation in it through as a form of AIDS prevention. And I know that happened here too, because you had to actually explicitly show, for example, how a condom was applied. And I remember going with there are people like, what was her name now? Sue, sex educator on television, who would have to, you justify the pornography through a pedagogical lens. I think that these things were circulated much more on the down low in bars and things. It's funny that this tape has had a kind of longevity despite its original intention, which was it's not an art tape. It's now been in museums and things, but it wasn't ever meant to be. It was meant to be shown in some little club in a basement. And so I have a feeling it just went under the radar. There certainly was no, there was no controversy around it or the safer sex shorts, as far as I know.
I did want to say something to Alex's question, which I think is a really good question. And it makes me think of, Guattari's models of the psychiatric institution in France in the 1960s. And his vision of these institutions would involve patients becoming psychiatrists and psychiatrists becoming janitors and janitors becoming patients. And this like absolute role reversal where everyone played the role of everything that made a psychiatric hospital possible. And I wonder if for a bathhouse to be truly radical, labor needs to be distributed in this way as well. That you can't just go there and have all the sex that you want and leave all your dirty towels behind, but you have to take part in the cleaning and the maintenance of the space, and really be invested in the space as a communal space. So a more communally distributed form of labor. I wonder if that's, just throwing it back to you, maybe like alongside the lines of what you were thinking.
Here's a question for you, Jess, that's from the chat, and maybe this is a little question that draws on yours, Fan, too, as well. Like, what would make a bathhouse or a public bathing site really radical? And Naomi's asked in the chat, Jess, in the bathhouse you envision, how do you imagine gender separation? Would it always be all gender, or would it be broken up? And maybe we can talk through some of these questions of gender as well. Like, how do we kind of reconcile these divisions?
Thank you for the question. It's a good question, and it was something that I actually didn't start off conceiving, and it was something that was brought up in my research very later on. I think I just immediately launched into the work with my, the bathhouse represents a certain fantasy of my own that's largely related to my own desire to relax my body and my sexuality in a space that's not my own home, or that's not just within the enclosures of my friends and my own tight community. So for me, it was always imagined as a space where gender wasn't really questioned, that it was a genderless space. It was never meant to be perhaps like a gay male bathhouse, despite a lot of the research relating to that. I did a project at U of T, which is it's an institution, and I did it within the architecture program, and I had to do a lot of work after creating this fantasy for myself and beginning this speculation on describing the relationships of gender, describing what queer meant, and it made me feel a little bit like after doing the thesis and finishing it, having to explain to people, I'm so sorry. I do love U of T. I don't mean to hate on it, but it made me want to, after post completing the project and having to explain, perhaps there could be nights for all men, or perhaps there could be nights for all women, and other nights are for queer people, or gender non-conforming, or all genders. Later on, after having completed the project, I really do feel like leaning into it is an ambiguously gendered space. It's a non-dichotomous gender space. And that feels important for me, and it feels important for the way that I relate to bathhouses as well. There's sometimes a bit of a patronizing about, having like dyke nights at bathhouses. It's not the space that I had imagined.
I don't know, I guess I'll just talk. But I have experience going to a bathhouse here in Halifax, and it's interesting. Something that I was initially thinking about is like how bathing is so secondary to like my experience at bathhouses, because I really have only other than like saunas in women's change rooms at gyms or whatever, my only bathhouse experiences are like pretty explicitly sexual, and like environments that are closer to like dungeons or like a swingers club than a bathhouse, but like is titled a bathhouse and whatever. And you know, like bathing, like there's a hot tub, that kind of thing, there are showers, but bathing is something that you do like after the sex, in my experience, or like in sort of the like timeline of like moving through meeting someone and flirting with them, whatever. Bathing is kind of like the summation. Like you don't, like, you might like stick your feet in the hot tub with someone and then, you know, go and have sex and then take a shower or whatever. But the act of bathing really isn't as central. And I feel like, you know, I feel like that's just a different type of bathhouse that exists. Like the place that I go to here is like, as opposed to being like, you know, a place for physical relaxation and bathing and whatever, is really like explicitly a sexual, like a sex hub, like a public sex place, and is also like 90% of the time for gay men, and then rented out once a week for a straight couple, a heterosexual couple party, and like once every 3 or 4 months for like a lesbian and trans night, which is, you know, the way that they've broken it all down. But I really like, you know, it's a dingy place with like porn being played on big screen TVs. It's like horrifying and whatever. Well, some of the porn is just like, but it's a really beautiful space that is like continues to exist, I think, because the entire kind of community of people who want to engage in a kind of like deviant sexuality or public sex or have that different type of relationship with sexuality, you know, like we all come together and rent out the place and book it for our own nights, and it's not accessible to like me all the time, but when it is, it's exciting, and it's definitely something that I like, you know, I want to support. It's sort of like, you know, it feels like a community center for like perverts, kind of. And that's really important to me, and like I wish I had more access to it, but you know, I'll take what I can get. But it's something I'm happy to be a part of, and that's my contribution. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe. I think it also brings us back to Naomi's question about gender, because there's a sort of tug of war of inclusion and exclusion in these spaces, right? To include a group of people risks making another group of people excluded. So what would it mean to create a space where inclusion doesn't entail exclusion? And that's like more of like a paradoxical or philosophical question maybe, but usually people just divide it into different times where everyone's included one or 2 days a week, right? But I think, how can we push to have a sort of space that's both safe and sexy, where the safety doesn't take away from the sexiness, where, you know, everyone can feel included without any other kind of body being there, you know, signifying their exclusion, you know? And it's a fascinating question. I don't really have any answers to it, but one worth pursuing, maybe.
Yeah, thank you. I think maybe one thing I'll also add is one of the things that is really, and phrases that's really stood out for me when I was doing my interviews with people in the community was one of the people I was interviewing was telling me, you know, I'm proud to be trans. I like to identify as trans, but I'm not here to put on a trans flag t-shirt every day and just, you know, wear that performance all the time. Or I don't necessarily always want to follow along the line of this is the trans night. And I think that it's an important question, and maybe I don't have the answer, but I think there is something there that it's difficult to feel like the exception or the one night you can participate, which I was hoping to achieve a bit more of a gradient in the Bed Bath and Beyond.
Does anyone want to share their like drawing or their prompt? I would love to see what people.
The writing.
Yeah.
I drew this when Fan was just talking about what we saw. The triangles are like tiles, I guess, and something about how when you move through water, light refracts, I think, was a lot of what I was thinking about.
Beautiful. Thanks for sharing.
I guess I feel like a really persistent theme tonight, and sorry I joined a bit late, is this idea of safety versus eroticism, right? Richard, you brought this up in your Steam Clean documentaries of how do we make safe sex sexy for the gay Asian community back in the 1990s. And Fan, you also talked about that dichotomy, especially, I really liked your phrasing of consent's threshold is lowered in the bathhouse. And you describe that kind of risky, but also in an alternate universe, very erotic encounter of someone trying to penetrate you without consent. And then there's all this stuff in high schools now about children being taught consent is sexy, how to have consensual or discussions around consent pre-initiation of intercourse. Again, I don't have any good answers for this, but again, you have older people, even from our generation, saying, oh, fuck, these consent questions are not sexy at all. But maybe there is a way to make them sexy, but again, there is always that marriage of danger with excitement. And I want to link it back to this idea of that the socioeconomic as well as the racial hierarchy between people who frequent the bathhouse as clients and then the people who work at the bathhouse as workers. And how, where was I going with this? That inequality is also displayed in the meat market of the bathhouse, but to a certain extent, we are very hierarchical creatures and we get sexually aroused in a hierarchical situation, right? Like maybe some people, even as much as they dislike the meat market aspect of their bodies being judged in a bathhouse, go there for that reason. And inevitably, it's not an egalitarian space, it's a very hierarchical space. And that again plays into the problem of how do we proceed with the architectural design? Anyway, I don't have any answers. This is all.
Can I say something? I think that in my experience, the bathhouse, gay male bathhouses, and I've been to many now around the world, are hierarchical, but they're hierarchical around different vectors of hierarchy of power than exist outside of that kind of heterotopic space. So that markers often of class kind of are very hard to find, right? So that you would have, for example, somebody who is a judge outside in the real world who has a lot of power, but then in the bathhouse they're an old man, right? So that their power to attract becomes different. One of the things I did want to say about bathhouses is that even though they're often set up for sex, it's always surprising to me how little sex can occur in a bath visit. So for instance, typical, you're usually allowed 4 hours or something. Very often I would go and not have sex at all. And in fact, I think that's the case. You see, the scenario, I love the unripe peach in Fan's account. And I've had that experience, I've seen that kind of experience, but in fact, that kind of behavior is seen to transgress the dominant etiquette at most bathhouses, where in fact there's a lot of looking, a lot of like shyness, in fact, and you can find naked people in an enclosed space and nobody's touching anybody, everybody's afraid to look, everybody's waiting for somebody to make the first move. So that is actually my experience of that. And in fact, I often used to go to, I don't go to bathhouses very often anymore, occasionally, but I see them as, for me, they're meditative spaces. And that's what I really love about going to the bathhouse. You walk around for 4 hours. You don't have to talk to anybody. You're actually thinking in your own mind. You may have a hookup, in which case, my partner loves to chat with people. They talk for hours. I generally don't. Probably partly because of those kinds of questions, like where are you from? Where are you really from? Kind of thing. But yeah, it is to me that it's like going to church. I grew up a Catholic, and there is something about the meditative space of a bathhouse that I really enjoy. And it's a kind of democracy too, because, you know, I'm the kind of person who I love now in COVID. I haven't actually personally experienced the anti-Asian racism that I keep hearing about and reading about. In fact, what I see in my neighborhood, and I live quite close to Dufferin Mall actually, is that people are really friendly on the street. And I have actually really, really enjoyed these kind of, I love intimacy with strangers. It makes me feel part of the world. It makes me kind of have a kind of, I don't know, perhaps an illusion of democratic relationships. And there is something about that intimacy, extreme intimacy in sexual relations with people that I don't know, that people who are, you know, you just come across. And there is something that I find really thrilling about that. And it's not a sexual thrill. It's in a funny kind of way, a political thrill that I feel in that kind of intimacy of the bathhouse. When it's not, when it's good. Because it could also be really disturbing and kind of, yeah, I'll just leave it at disturbing.
Guys, I have a question for frequenters of bathhouses. Do you guys ever talk politics with strangers while fucking? Thanks.
I've never talked about politics, so I'm gonna exit this conversation.
Sometimes, you know, as I said, my partner has long conversations with people, and they get into very deep conversations around politics. I do, depending on the person. And you know, the thing about okay, so I was saying something that about markers of class, and this is something that fascinates me, and I just share it with you. It's a little bit funny, but I have been struck because more than once, people have said to me, "You seem so educated," and there is, and I kind of, or "You seem intelligent," and I don't know if that's a kind of backhanded comment, but it makes me really think about the codes of how we communicate things by, you know, by syntax, you know, like how we speak, the way the kind of cultural capital, how cultural capital is marked. And I kind of wonder about that as well, in terms of kind of when politics come in, and that's the other thing that I kind of enjoy about this, because I realize my world is so made up with many of the people probably who are on this webinar, you know, people who may not have a lot of money, but have an education or have a kind of engagement with politics or engagement with culture and art. And that's really my world. And to step out of that world is what I find really thrilling. You know, somebody who works in a 9-to-5 job, lives in the suburbs, and has no real relationship except with occasionally maybe voting or something. And yeah, that's the kind of excitement that I get across around hookups.
Are there any last thoughts? Last questions?
Maybe not, I guess. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and sorry to pull us out of the discussional, sorry to rip us out, but yeah, it was such a wonderful event. Thank you guys so much. Richard, Fan, Jess, Greta, oh my God, superstars.
Thank you.